tell you a little bit more about Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio before we get started. So this is what we do. We are a nonprofit in Cincinnati and Dayton, powered by attorney volunteers. We strengthen our community by providing free business legal services to nonprofits. So we're really proud of our numbers. So we've only been in existence for a little over 6 years. And in that time, we've had almost 900 attorneys in the area volunteer their time for free to assist over 300 local nonprofits on about 2,000 different legal projects. In addition to that, we host over 100 workshops and educational outreach events, both seminars and webinars, low cost or free for our nonprofit community. So these are just some of the legal type projects that we handle. You'll see anything from board governance to contracts and real estate, employment law, and I wrote mergers on there. We have had our share of mergers, which has been really fun to deal with. So who qualifies to become a client? The organizations have to be 501c3 public charities located in Cincinnati or Dayton. Yes, I understand I crossed a bridge to get here today, so I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Our clients have to show that they are unable to pay for legal services and offer programs that are actually making an active impact in our community. And educational outreach. So like I mentioned, some of the organizations in the room do qualify for our services and may already be clients, but many don't because you're in Kentucky or your budgets are too big or you, for some reason, don't qualify for our services. But one thing that we really do focus on is educational outreach. And what we hear from our nonprofit community the most is we don't know what we don't know. And you are the best at issue spotting within your organization, so that whether you come to us or you come to experts like Ron Christian at Taft or Bryan here at VonLehman, that you can spot those issues for yourselves and your organizations and then seek out the help that you can access. So we provide low cost or free seminars and webinars. We like to collaborate, like with our friends at VonLehman, on a wide range of topics, and we also publish articles and legal alerts. So if you'd like to sign up for that mailing list or look into becoming a client, please feel free to reach out to us. And with that, let me hand it over to our experts today. Here you go, Bryan.
My name is Bryan Pautsch. I am a principal and nonprofit tax expert here at VonLehman. I've worked with tax-exempt organizations for 25, 30 years. Prior to coming here, I was a partner in charge of the nonprofit tax service for a top 30 CPA firm. VonLehman's got the client base, which is what I really enjoy. I spend full-time, 100% of my time working with nonprofit organizations on their tax issues. Today, we're going to be talking about legal and other considerations related to nonprofit organizations, affiliations, and mergers. Our agenda today, Ron will be talking. Ron is a partner over at Taft Law, and I'll let Ron give you the bio on him when it's time. But we'll be talking about the different types of mergers and different structures that are out there. Ron will be going through and talking about the advantages, disadvantages, and other considerations that you need to consider when you're merging or coming together with another nonprofit. The next aspect is the due diligence process. This is the process that you go through to kind of understand the organization that you're merging into. You're going to be looking at sharing financial information. You're going to share legal documents. It's kind of a way in which you can start looking at the organization. You want to avoid any surprises out there. And I'll give you some thoughts as to what I've experienced over my time. There are surprises out there when you go through it. And then what we'll talk about, Ron will come back and we'll finish up with the other affiliation considerations and then different questions that you guys might have. Again, this is basically the beginning part of the presentation is more looking at how do you merge, what structures do you have, how do you go about doing it through the due diligence process, and then we'll talk about the other issues that are out there and what questions that come up. So, Brian, I'll turn it over to you. It's this button right here.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Good morning, everybody. As Brian mentioned, I'm Ron Christian, partner with the Taft Law firm. Good to see a few familiar faces and friendly faces in the audience. That's always nice. As he also mentioned, I have the very fortunate opportunity that I get to concentrate my practice in working with charities, nonprofit organizations, foundations, and helping with all the various legal issues, certainly tax, but governance, working with them. Now it's really any almost general counsel really for any of the kind of things that come up. I'm also fortunate to be with a firm where I have lots of expertise in really every area that can come up. And you know, nonprofits, as all of you know in the room, are like any other businesses. I mean, they have employee issues, they have retirement fund issues, they have intellectual property issues. The beauty of that is I don't have expertise in that personally, but I have lots of people who are literally experts in all of those areas. So in corporate and other areas, real estate, et cetera. So kind of a full shop for handling any of the kind of issues that come up in that connection. I also help them again with their tax issues, help them a lot working with their donors, charitable gifts, work with a lot of foundations that do grant agreements, et cetera. So, you know, who knew you could make a living basically helping charities do that? It's a wonderful way. I get to work with lots of wonderful organizations and lots of wonderful people in that connection. So good to be with you this morning. We've got a small group, obviously. Feel free to, and I think we're going to have plenty of time. I don't think we're going to be pushed on that this morning. So feel free to ask questions, at least from my perspective, as we go along. We will have time at the end, as Bryan mentioned, for questions. I think we've left plenty of time for that. And then I expect most of you, maybe all of you, are here because you are particularly interested in this in connection with something you're doing with some organizations rather than maybe as a garden variety general interest topic. So, you know, I want to pull us aside after this or whatever. I've certainly got at least a few minutes after that. So happy to chat with you in that respect. So as Bryan mentioned, the first thing we're going to talk about are the types of ways to combine or affiliate. And really the first part of the outline, honestly, is really, I've been fortunate to be able to do this with lots of organizations. It's interesting. I've helped individual organizations with this. Sometimes I've had both organizations come to me together and say, we know we want to combine, we're in the process. You know, a lot of times they'll have consultants helping them kind of work through that process. And we're trying to figure out what's the best legal structure for our particular circumstances and situations to do our combination. And the answer is it depends, because it depends on the particular situation, the two organizations. And really what I use, the outline I'm going to go through is really the same outline I often either go through with them in person or at least mentally, is trying to help them say, what are the kind of the advantages and disadvantages of the different approaches and which one makes the most sense for your particular situation. So we'll talk, here's the ones we'll talk through. The outright merger, it's funny, people use, not surprisingly, they use the term merger to mean any kind of combination, but really that's from a legal standpoint, that's one way of doing a combination or affiliation. We'll talk through the parent subsidiary approach, using a holding company, doing asset transfers, and very briefly on a few other kind of affiliation techniques. So the first one, again, merger, but in this case, we're going to use the true legal term. Essentially, this is where you have two nonprofit corporations legally combined into one organization. You do a merger agreement, they combine, and when the dust clears, or the smoke clears, there's one organization. Two ways of doing it. Usually the way I see that is one organization merges into the other organization, and that's done by filing a certificate of merger, saying, okay, at whatever effective date, those are going to be one organization. And you could also form a new organization if both of them go into that. I rarely see that, but that is another way to do that.
Is that one, when you're talking about actually setting up Corporation C, you got to go through, you're forming a new organization, so you got to apply for tax exempt status, so you got to do everything over again. So I agree with Ron. I really don't see that as often.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a possibility, but not something we see nearly as often. So again, as I'll go through, so what are the advantages and disadvantages of that? So advantages, it's pretty simple to understand. Okay, after we do this, we've combined into one surviving organization. And going forward, if you only have one board to manage, and this is comparing it, if you will, as you'll see in a minute, to the other approaches. So at the end, we've combined. We've got one organization. We only have one board to manage. Usually, you're having two tax-exempt organizations, almost always with the same exempt status. I actually have occasionally had that had different tax-exempt status. But then the survivor continues to keep its status. You have to get notice to the IRS about it, but you can kind of move along your merry way with that. But what are the disadvantages? Well, the biggest one that makes this used somewhat less frequently is when you combine all your assets together. You're also combining all your liabilities together. Now, Bryan will talk about this, and we'll do the due diligence, so you know about your debts, loans, contracts, those kinds of things. But you're also bringing in all the unknown liabilities. What if an employee comes out of the past and sues you, some other activity you've done, you've got some environmental issue with your real estate? You're now combining all your assets and exposing those to all the liability risk historically and going forward of both organizations. Because of that requires, in all of these, any kind of combination, you're going to do due diligence, but this one, you're really going to want to be careful about your due diligence. I mean, before we do this, let's make sure there's not something out there that we can anticipate. Probably there's always some unknown things that you can't always anticipate. A third part of that, when you combine and one organization goes away and the other, how does that impact the constituents of the organization that goes away? They feel like they've been gobbled up. It's like, well, wait, we've got a name, we've got an image and brand, we have people that love us. How do they feel about that, or how our clients, other people we work with, how are they going to be impacted by the fact that we're now part of that of other organization? You may need to obtain consents from third parties, banks, governmental organizations that you may work with, contractual landlords, things like that. Another disadvantage, harder to unwind. Now, always when you go into these combinations, I sometimes, and probably not always wisely, analogize this to other relationships where people combine together, with personal relationships. You obviously don't want to go into it planning the exit strategy, but you also can't, from my perspective, you can't completely ignore it either. At least something you want to be aware of with that. And I think in all the years of doing this, and my great grandmother did this for, in my case, over 30 years, I actually have had one combination. It's interesting, it was completely amicable when they, after a year or two, that this, it's been a number of years, I won't mention who it was, but the organizations came together. They did use a different approach, as I'll discuss in a moment, and they decided down the road it didn't do what they had hoped it would do, and because they used the other approach, actually it was fairly manageable for them to separate back out and kind of go back their own way without too much trouble. I think in this case you co-mingled everything, you put all your assets into one basket. You've also gotten rid of an organization, so if you wanted to start over, now you got to go back and start another organization. You got to wait until you get a tax exempt again. So it's harder to unwind that. And then I kind of alluded to this before with the branding. I mean, if you make it, one organization goes away, kind of hard to maintain that branding, that image of the other. Now maybe you can do it with some programming, things like that, but it's more difficult to do that. Another approach, second approach here, and this is actually probably the one I've done most over the years, is a parent-subsidiary approach. So essentially, in a parent-subsidiary approach, one organization, as its name implies, becomes the sole member, becomes the parent of the organization. This typically is a situation where one of the organizations is a fair amount larger than the other organization, so it's a little bit clear like who's going to, if you will, be the governing organization going forward. And so that essentially it's accomplished by changing legally by changing the organizational documents of the organization that's going to become the subsidiary of it, maybe kind of viewed as becoming acquired, to make the sole member of that who then will have the right to appoint at least a majority, sometimes all of the board members of the organization going forward. Advantages of this, as you'll pick up from our conversation, a lot of these are, converses of the other approaches. Well, when you go forward, you still have your two separate nonprofit corporations. You're keeping your liability risk up, and the activities of one are not imputed on the other. So, if there are liability risks, you've got those still separated from each other. You're not exposing the assets of one organization to those. And you kind of go forward, if you think about it, you're still got your same, if you want, the same names of the organization, so got your contracts, et cetera. You may have to get some approvals from, again, parties that you're contracting with, from agencies that you're working with, et cetera. But you can kind of keep going forward. It still allows, though, and this is usually what happens with this, is a lot of the strategic planning, the HR, the accounting, the payroll, IT, all those things. A lot of times the parent organization, which oftentimes the much smaller organization has been struggling with a lot of those things. Retirement benefits can be another aspect of that that's not unimportant at all. So a lot of that can now be done by the parent organization, if you will, for the benefit of the whole group under the identity. It does allow you, if you want, and again, each situation is different, if it makes sense to try to continue to maintain that brand of the subsidiary, it didn't go away. It still exists. It can still, and that may be very important to some of your donors, some of your constituents, some of your funders. To the extent you want to do that, sometimes I see this as organizations are trying to expand geographically. You're going to have one move into another county, another area like that. Their name means a lot in that county. I don't really want to lose that as we go forward, at least particularly in the short run as we transition, until people kind of get comfortable with us moving there. We want them to say, no, that's still the organization, still the people we work with there. That can matter. You've already got tax exempt entities. You can do this from a legal standpoint, and the other aspects of it. Quickly as you can do the due diligence, and you can move forward with that pretty quickly. And then, as I referenced a few minutes ago, you can unwind this. If you get down a year or two, like, this wasn't what we thought, you're fine, I'm fine, but let's, you haven't combined legally all of your assets, all of your activities. You still all have your tax exempt status. You could just reverse the organizational documents and give them back as a perpetuating board. They could go back on their own way. So there is the ability to do that going forward. Yeah, David.
I have a question. When you say,
I used to give a reward to the first person to ask a question to try to encourage me.
so when you
I
say,
still do that.
when you say limits exposure to liability, let's say the subsidiary had some or will have some, I don't know, gruntled employees claims or something. So do they? How does it limit it? Does the subsidiary handle it on its own, or
Yeah,
how does that happen?
yeah. When I say limited, you're not exposing the assets of both organizations. You're not, that would have to be covered by the subsidiary's assets or their insurance, et cetera. So essentially, if you get more of this catastrophic aspect of it, you're not, all right, and this, it could go to employee claim, it could be environmental, whatever. You're not kind of risking the whole egg of both organizations for a claim that came up for a little bit.
Because what happens here really is the organizations, both of them, are still in existence. So if they're right here like this, then all you're doing is this entity becomes a sole member of this entity down below, the subsidiary, what kind of talk.
And that doesn't expose the parent to liability.
Correct. Again, they continue to exist as separate, and you want to, of course, continue to observe corporate formalities. So you don't want to. So they're going to have a lot of input, but that organization is still going to have its own board. Sometimes, and this varies in my experience. Sometimes it still has a fair number of the old board members, like lots of they're going to continue to fundraise, et cetera. Sometimes most of that board will go away, and oftentimes, frankly, kind of voluntarily, that they're involved. You may have seen it anyway. That there's organizations kind of board that just they're exhausted. They're ready for somebody to come in and kind of take over. with that. But it's still going to have separate board meetings, have its own control, which kind of the key overarching things, largely by pointing who that board is how they maintain control. But it's still going to be making its own operating decisions. They'll have its own board meetings and so.
I was just wondering if
Yeah.
courts or whatever would look at it and say basically the parent's appointing all the board members clearly
Yeah,
has control. You'd think that people would try to sue the parent.
Yeah, well, and let me be clear here. It's probably helpful not to talk in absolutes. I mean,
Yeah.
people can sue.
Yeah, sure.
Over anything. Say, hey,
Yeah.
you're really managing it. You're really controlling it. There could be varying degrees of that.
Yeah.
But certainly, you're creating an additional hurdle. I mean, like
Yeah.
it still exists. I mean,
Yeah.
you look at all businesses. This is one of the reasons they have subsidiaries. They're separating not only their activities and business planning and programmatically, but also separating the liability risk from each other. So, yeah, I mean, is that an absolute protection? Could they sue and say, hey, you've been responsible for it? Certainly, but it should give you a pretty good protection in anything. Yeah.
Is it more typical that a parent subsidiary, there would still be two boards, or is it a mix? I mean,
Yeah, so should we repeat questions? This is being recorded. Hopefully they can hear you. So the question I think is, well, certainly you're still going to have two boards of the organ. I mean, you're still going to have a board from the beginning. You've got two separate nonprofit corporations. They each have their own board. Now, what varies is the composition of that. So I've seen lots of different structures happen from that. A fairly frequent from that is some of the board members, at least a couple of the subsidiary, may now go up to what I'll call the big board, the parent board, so that they have so there's some voice and some connection between the parent subsidiary from that standpoint. Sometimes that'll be built into the affiliation agreement. A lot depends on, again, the particular circumstance, situation. Do they desire to have that representation? And oftentimes, and usually they do, at least in the short run for some period of time. Again, likewise, sometimes I see a lot of the boards stay the same. Sometimes it almost gets completely changed, but they will each still have their own boards, and those typically will not be. And back to the liability separation, you don't want those to be, generally speaking, all exactly the same people. You want to show that there's some separation from the people making the decisions, and the distinction between the two organizations.
can you give an example locally, charitable organization that has parent subsidiary?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of one. Calvert House has a number of subsidiary organizations. St. Aloysius did before they did their other combination. Maybe they still do, where they had kind of some geographic. They were going into other locations from that. And again, that's a pretty frequent scenario. Again, typically with a larger sometimes expanded geographically, sometimes when you get into another area, sometimes the other organization will. We'll talk about this more later. Kind of the kinds of things that kind of drive this. I guess I could go ahead and mention that. I mean, frankly, from my experience, a few different things tend to drive the desire to have this. For this scenario, a lot of times it's an organization in part that may be struggling financially. We really need some more support from a larger organization in what we're doing. In the larger organization, I say, well, we'd really like to. You've got a good name in this geographic area, in some particular area. If we could strengthen up you in that respect, but we're 10 times as large as you, so this is kind of and also, it can be an interim step to make them a subsidiary or something. Can we make sure there's no, we're going to do our due diligence and all that, but let's make you a subsidiary for a while. Make sure nothing kind of comes out of this that we need to be concerned about going forward. Another thing that tends to drive affiliations, being the tailor maybe doing itself, but a lot of these have founders or other leaders. When there's a leadership transition, so you've got a leader that's going to lead your organization, your president, they're going to retire, they're going to leave, whatever. Well, then your board of your organization says, okay, we need to go find your replacement. And sometimes there's not a natural fit for that. or is an alternative to that to consider, there's another organization that does something similar to what we do. They have great talent with that. Is this should we have a conversation with them to see if we should be combining and working with them together? And then the third, probably, and we'll talk about this in the other considerations, is just synergies. You guys are really good at this. We're really good at something else that's kind of complementary to that. In addition to the economies of scale that come with working together, probably efficiencies, is this a chance to really take advantage of your particular programmatic expertise, your particular relationships in the community that we'd like to expand into, and vice versa? You're going to, the other's going to bring other complementary things to that. So those are the kind of synergies that bring, in my experience, together. Bryan, I don't know what you know. You have other thoughts about?
No, I think that's correct. The other thing that, when you have this parent sub aspect, I am not an auditor, I'm purely a tax person. Stephanie heads up our nonprofit tax area, our nonprofit area, and she's unfortunately sick today. But sometimes when you have a parent sub relationship, just be careful of your audit, that you may have to have a consolidated audit report. So just keep that in mind. There are a bunch of rules in there that I prefer not to know that make you have a consolidated audit report. So just realize that that's important.
That was exactly my question, the audit.
So, disadvantages of this approach, as opposed to the merger, we've got, now we just have one organization managed, and you've got two organizations to manage. So you're gonna have, you do have to have separate board meetings, observe those corporate formalities. You got to maintain and manage those things. You have to still have separate tax returns. You mentioned the audit. I think from that, sometimes you have consolidated. Probably the ability to consolidate of it, but then also separate financial. You obviously got to do separate tax returns. So you got to have separate financials. And then control, determining. Usually this is fairly obvious, but who's going to be the parent subsidiary? What's going to be that? Now you've got to work out the mechanics between your boards. Are there some of the people from the subsidiary board going to go up to the other organization, have some at least input and say so going forward? How do you work all of that out? You still have a little bit of the issue with your constituents. It's like, it looks much more like you're being, if you will, acquired or coming under the umbrella of the other. How does that make the, for lack of a better word, the little brother, the subsidiary, and the people who are involved with them, how do they feel? How much does that upset the apple cart for them? Again, you may have to get consents from third parties, government organizations, typically banks, contractual relationships, and then we mentioned the consolidated audits. The subsidiary board does maintain the legal authority for the oversight of its operations. And then I referenced this before. The sole member has the right to appoint the board, like to remove the directors, or essentially at least all the key things, and typically is doing kind of the strategic planning going forward. That's why a lot of times a few members of the subsidiary board will go up, and now they're part of kind of the governing group to try to make those decisions more broadly for the combined organizations going forward. The third approach, set up a new holding company. So you can see this, the two subsidiaries are the two existing organizations, and rather than one combining it together, one becoming the parent of the other, they set up a new organization that, hey, we're going to both send people up to a new parent organization. They'll have to form a new nonprofit corporation, get it tax exempt, but then it's going to be the parent of both the organizations. Have used this. It keeps the same separation. Again, you haven't combined legally your organizations. They continue to exist. You can maintain the names and identities of those. Again, you haven't, if you think about it now, you haven't created the one overarching one organization over the other. You've created a new organization that both are going to use to try to do all the strategic planning, the accounting, HR, IT, all the planning for both organizations. Where I've seen this, frankly, is where they're often considering adding other organizations. Okay, these two organizations together, but they really have hopes or plans to talk to other organizations and kind of bring them also under the umbrella. I've seen this in a smaller, if you think about a real world big example of this, if you look at TriHealth, we've got TriHealth, but it's got a Good Samaritan Hospital, it's got Bethesda, you still think of Good Samaritan Hospital, you still think Bethesda, they haven't lost their underlying identity. Now, that's obviously a big example. A lot of healthcare organizations, but I also had other kind of social service to that, where you can still kind of keep your underlying, people still can feel their affiliation, their relationship with the underlying entity, while still having a parent that's kind of overarching, making the decisions, the big picture decisions for the organizations. You could, again, the advantage of that, you're still keeping all the separate organizations that are these big affiliations, but at some point, the underlying organization could go back on its own, and that, again, in healthcare, there are examples where that's happened. You have a disadvantage, you're setting up a new organization, you've got to organize it, you've got to apply for tax exempt status, which can take months and months to get that. Now you've added a third board that has to have meetings, that has to manage this and still keeping the others. I have done this though in a situation, now usually in this scenario where you've got the parent, you've really got people going out from the other typically the boards of the other organizations to the new organizations. Oftentimes you'll kind of streamline the underlying boards in that case. So, I've seen where there are a lot of just officers of the organization that become the underlying boards that are running that, because really now they've got the consolidated power at the parent. What I was going to mention though, I've also done this in one technique. After the parent got its tax exempt status, is converted the nonprofit subsidiary corporations into single-member nonprofit LLCs. And the reason for that, those are still separate organizations for liability purposes, so you're still keeping your risk separated with that, but you can eliminate having 3 tax returns if it's a single-member LLC. So for state law purposes, those are still separate organizations, but for federal tax purposes, they're all considered to be the subsidiaries are considered to be disregarded organizations. So for tax purposes, federal tax purposes only, they're all one. So they can file one tax return going forward.
So it's kind of effectively sort of like a merger, not a merger per se that but basically for tax purposes, these two entities just merge up to that holding company. And now that holding company is basically, for tax purposes, carrying out all of the activities of the five organizations.
That's right. Now, if those underlying organizations are still doing a lot of fundraising, probably less. I mean, you still can do it legally. You may be less likely to do it for that. Because donors will, well, I can't find your tax return on GuideStar. Now legally they can give to them or give to the parent. It's still deductible from a charitable standpoint. Bottom line, it creates confusion, and obviously as you're trying to raise money, you don't want confusion among your donors, so that you don't typically see it from that standpoint. But if you're, I see this healthcare where they're mainly doing operating activities at those levels, not the fundraising at that, and it works perfectly fine. Yes, sir.
I was just curious, like a holding company, like I don't know how the money flows in that situation, because like if you donate to those subsidiaries, I mean, are they allowed to give money to the holding? I don't know how that works.
Yeah, they're all going to be fine. Typically, these scenarios we're talking about 501c3 organizations, so you have pretty liberal rules for being able to transfer funds back, and they're all operating for kind of a common mission, if you will. So you got a lot of flexibility of moving funds back and forth.
And Jen, what I have seen is that when you have that organization and they're not being merged up, you have this parent holding company. That's really what they consider to be a supporting organization that basically carries out all the different functions in order to support the two organizations. And that's why you see it in the healthcare area, because they have a lot of the management employees or whatever will be up on top as actually employees of the holding company, and then they'll charge things back between the two operating entities. entities.
Yeah.
So that's typically what I've seen when you have that holding company as an existing entity. Because if it's just a holding company where it's just holding the interest of the two entities, it's not really carrying on any charitable activities, right? It's there. You've got to pass the public support test, and that's what supporting them. Now we're getting into more technical stuff. Sorry.
Yeah, I debated that. So, yeah, so Brian's getting it. Actually, very important, and very much we're getting into the weeds probably for us and for that. No, but the point being, your parent organization is not doing the particular activity. They're planning for those activities done in the other organization. So how do they qualify to be tax exempt? And essentially, as a supporting order, they're an integral part of, but for their existence, those organizations would be doing those things for themselves. Technically, very important, not only to be a 501c3, but you want to be a public charity, not a private donation type of that. And so you have to have certain legal relationships with those underlying organizations. And so actually two things. One, in about, 2 hours, I'm having a pretty complicated conversation with some folks about exactly this question. Second, it's interesting if you go to the single nonprofit LLCs, now you actually are doing the activities because you're only legally you're a separate organization. For tax purposes, you're only one organization. So now you're actually doing those charitable activities, and so you're not a supporting organization where you're actually conducting those directly.
Okay, so now I'm curious,
And
and I don't want to go deep into it, but would that technically be a type 3? Is it a
type 3?
4? Is it a, I mean,
This is great.
don't go into the details.
I spent 8 minutes talking to people. CFOs about supporting organizations. It was my claim to fame. I loved it. But yeah, when you look at supporting organizations, there's a whole bunch of different types. In type 3, there's two different types, functionally and non-functionally integrated. Generally, when you see in the healthcare setting, it's more of a type 1 where they're, controlling, more of a parent self aspect. So they're kind of controlling boards. It's typically what you can see.
Yeah. We can put our green I mean, critically important because you definitely, obviously you have to be a 501c3 and you definitely want to be a public charity. That's where you really do get in the weeds. As tempting as it is to get into that, I think 90% of you are going to really hate that conversation. If anybody wants to have that conversation in more detail, we're happy to do that. But I think for the purposes of this, we'll move forward. But the fact that you knew they were different types, and getting deeper in the weeds, there's 2 types of the type 3, functionally integrated and functionally non-functionally integrated. But again, that's literally the conversation I get to have here later this morning on a pretty complicated transaction. Another approach, I don't see this as much, but certainly another way you can do it, is just to do an asset transfer. You just transfer assets and whatever liabilities. It could be a whole combination of, hey, we're just going to do an asset transfer. We're going to transfer all our assets, all our known liabilities to the other organization for the program. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can say, okay, we'll just transfer through the assets and liabilities related to this particular program, this particular activity. If you only transfer some of the assets, then the other organization continues to exist. If you transfer everything, then after you transfer all your assets, all your liabilities, dissolve, and the one that does that goes away. Too fast. Advantages, again, hopefully limit some of the you're transferring the known liability risk. You're going to have to assume debts and things like that. You hope that might help limit taking on the unknown things from the other organization. But unlike a merger where you're legally becoming both organizations essentially responsible for everything that's happened before for both organizations, you hope that might limit that. And again, allows you to do it if you only want to transfer some into a partial combination of some type. Disadvantages, it just takes a lot of time to transfer everything, transfer your assets, so particularly all your contracts, get approvals, do all those things. You have to get typically consents. And back to the merger, like the merger, it's a little harder to unwind once you put the things in there and everything gets commingled. It's pretty hard to, and particularly when that first organization goes away, it's kind of, you're back to starting over if you wanted to try to unwind the situation. Others, I'm really just going to talk about these very briefly. Interlocking boards, it's actually one I have not seen, but certainly seen discussed. The idea of, like, and this could be maybe a first step to kind of moving forward. We could keep our organizations, but let's appoint the same board members for both organizations. I mean, that's who controls the organization. You could do that, and if that works out well, so you're kind of under the same people. By the way, you also wouldn't have to keep doing that. Like, you don't have to make it mandatory to do it, but you could. I've not actually seen that. I've seen that discussed. I have a lot to. Have you ever seen that? So I mentioned it because I've seen that referenced. Management agreements, I have seen that a few times. Again, this gets back to kind of the leadership void. All right, we lost our CEO or whatever. Maybe while we're looking to find one, rather than having an interim or somebody who can manage our office. We can bring in someone that has CEO experience, but they don't have any experience in managing the kind of programmatic things we can do. You can contract with another organization that works in that area to kind of manage and oversee, provide that kind of oversight for collaboration. Back to kind of how do we get to the other consideration that how do you start going through this process? Well, a natural way to do that is, can you work with another organization on some project together? Hey, let's go get a grant and let's try this activity together. It's, back to the personal, it gives you a little bit a chance to do a little dating and kind of say, okay, how do they operate? Let's get to know their people, and they get to know our people. Let's work. It would be great for our community for us to work together on this project, and let's see what comes of that. Maybe that would be a kind of a step toward that. And then joint ventures. Occasionally you'll see, again, in healthcare, sometimes in education, organizations really go together. That can be on an ancillary basis with a particular program or activity, or it could be occasionally with healthcare and others. It could be all in. We're going to put all our eggs in one basket. We'll keep our 7 underlying entities, but we're going to have an agreement of how we share the net revenues from that and all of those aspects. So with that, the next step we're going to talk about, I'm going to kick this to Bryan, is okay. We know we want to do this. We're starting to talk with them. Let's start to kick the tires and find out, all right, more information, do a non-disclosure agreement, start to get the confidential information. If we're going to really move forward with this, let's make sure there's no surprises with that. So, Bryan, I'll shift spots with her and let you take the lead.
Can I ask a quick question before we move on?
Yep.
I know you said interlocking boards you don't see a lot of, but the first red flag in my mind was fiduciary responsibilities. How does that work when the board is the same in both organizations and the interests aren't probably not fully aligned?
Yeah, I've seen it discussed. I've not seen it in real life, so I'm not. The reason I didn't spend, I debated taking it back out. Probably I should have, but how do you? So I can't discuss that in any detail. Again, it does give you back to the unwind. If you say, okay, you could do it. I mean, basically, the board appoints their board members, so that they wanted to appoint the same board members or some of the same board members. Try to get acquainted to see if that you could do it. They still have their own fiduciary responsibilities in those organizations. I mean, they're not financially or legally combining in any way. I'm not selling that approach in any way because I've never seen it used, but I have seen it discussed at least in discussions about ways nonprofits can affiliate.
So when you talk about all these different ways it could be done, is it basically just up to the boards to figure out what, like, it didn't seem like you ever said, if you're doing this, you can't use this option. It felt like all of them are on the table. Is there any?
What I've actually found is kind of working through that checklist for organizations. Most of the time, there's kind of a clear, this is our situation. This is who we are. Not always. but if you've got a $20 million in your organization combining with a $1 million organization, they want to get into Butler County or Claremont County or whatever. Not unusually that they'll go with that parent subsidiary approach. And again, the other part of the parent subsidiary is you can do that for a while, and at some point, again, if you've done it for a number of years, it usually makes sense to keep it because, hey, it's still if something bad happens there, we don't want that to risk our financial assets at our level. And in that scenario, you often want to keep a local presence and name, and not, you still want the Bethesda name. I'm fine for Tri-Health, but I want the donor wants their money to go to Bethesda, or they want it to go. But that's their relationship is with that underlying organization that you don't want to lose that. The others, again, usually kind of go through the advantages and disadvantages with each of your situations that you're considering is different. As you go through that, usually one or at least only, you can at least eliminate a few of those and then decide which you think is going to be the best approach for your situation.
Because it is very competitive.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, it is very, very difficult to figure out and say, this is the structure. You really have to kind of, as Ron kind of said, you look at it and you actually will eliminate certain things. I'm not going to do this. I don't want this other organization to go away, so I'll get rid of a merger. I don't want to do that. Or this organization is struggling, it's merging up. Well, once it doesn't want to exist anymore, well then the parent something isn't going to work.
Yeah.
So it all varies.
Yeah, if you got a very large and a much smaller, the larger one's probably not going to say, yes, we're going to give you equal control. Over it. It's just a practical aspect. So again, not always, but the vast majority of the time, if I go through that, if I have started having a discussion, it's pretty clear to me they fit in one or at least only a couple of those. You're not usually having to factor all those in because you're going to eliminate a lot of those as you kind of go through the process as a practical matter.
Are the foundational documents that set up these arrangements, are they legally enforceable? It seems like there's such a variety. Like if you're dissolving one organization or an organization is losing their branding and an identity, in a perfect world, everybody would do what they say they're going to do, but that doesn't always happen. Yeah. So is there legal?
It varies. Usually I'll have an affiliation agreement between the two men, basically what commitments they're making going forward with that.
And is that legally enforceable as opposed to like an MOU?
Yes, it should. Yes, absolutely,
okay.
It should be. It does get complicated. I will say, but yes, I mean, it's a binding commitment they're making to how they're going to do the arrangement. And again, sometimes they'll have things like, we agree, like the parent sub, we agree that for the next 5 years you're going to have 2 board representatives of the other organization, serve on the board of the parent organization, including one executive committee. We agree to not discontinue these programmatic activities for some period of time. It's hard to kind of make that, as a practical matter, go on for, the future is hard to tell, if you will. So, but you can certainly make, at least for some period of time, these are commitments that you have to apply.
So a question about, merging but keeping that branding. So one of the groups has a really good name. Is one option is in the complete merger, just one of the facilities or businesses just says doing business as, they can keep that name and keep the grants and funding sources still using that name?
Yeah, there are ways to, and in fact, you still do want to keep particularly the DBA. So another consideration that comes into this, do we have, requests out there, including ones we don't know about, by the way, that names our organization. We don't want to necessarily have that. So that's a consideration you would take into, we don't want to lose that or create, wait, that organization doesn't exist anymore. We don't want to have to contest that in court whether we get that, request down the road. So yes, you can certainly, even if you merge, reserve the right to continue to use the name. You also don't want somebody else to come and use the name and create that confusion, for example, with regard to the request. So yeah, there are steps to try to maintain that from from a branding standpoint. I mean, think about like, you got P&G that got, you got Tide, you got all the press, you can certainly try to maintain the underlying brand of the organization as best you can.
Related to a future request, I was curious about with an asset transfer, is it more difficult with an asset transfer if there is a bequest that names the dissolved organization, that it seems like there may not be as much of a legal trail to follow?
It is harder with that. I think, you can, again, they can reserve, as part of that kickback, they can reserve that as a DBA. One of their other DBA names is a way to try to do that, and we would try to do that. Again, if that's a significant consideration, that could impact which approach you use.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We have one client that actually set up a supporting organization because of that, because they had one of the organizations that basically they were concerned about how many, the wells this name was in. So they just took the organization and turned it into a supporting organization. So they had to go to the IRS, change the public charity status to a supporting organization that supports the entity that's still in existence. And that way, there isn't a public support test that they need to pass or anything. And if there are, requests that come.
Yeah, so rather than, you don't have to dissolve it,
Right.
transfer the assets.
So that supporting organization was more or less a shell, just waiting to have a bequest pour in if it ever happened.
Yes.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. I know that basically what due diligence is effectively just a process which confidential legal and financial information is exchanged and reviewed by the different parties. Really, your ultimate goal is to avoid any surprises, as Ron kind of mentioned. You don't want to get involved in some type of situation where all of a sudden there's this big, huge, unknown liability out there that just hits you. So that's what the due diligence process really is the goal is for. One of the things as you're going through the due diligence process too, you start thinking about how can we bring this together? What process? We'll go through some of the checklists that I have. Basically, after this slide, I put together a checklist. This is basically a situation where we had a national organization and they had different chapters across the country, all separate C3 organizations. And they decided to say, we didn't want 8 organizations anymore. We just want one national organization. So that's the checklist that I started, and we walked through that aspect. And again, due diligence includes we have many types of documents and information. Depending upon what type of merger, acquisition, affiliation, structure you're getting into, you'll have to kind of take your due diligence process and kind of tweak it a little bit. First of all, just some of the basic stuff. You're going to have to go through all the articles of incorporation, bylaws, annual reports, corporate minute book. That's all gets reviewed. Policies are always important. The conflict of interest, whistleblower, document retention, reviewing 990. The conflict of interest policy is always one I always consider one of the big ones. I always talk to exempt clients, making sure that you have a conflict of interest policy, that you do ask what potential conflicts are out there. You do review that policy, and if a conflict does exist, that you make sure that that board member is not able to vote on that issue, and have that documented in your minutes. At an IRS audit, they wanted to see it documented in the minutes that this person was had a conflict and could not vote. So make sure you put that in the minutes. Again, the 990 policy about just reviewing the 990. Then in regard to organization and registration information, just again knowing what the organization chart is, that they're in good standing in all the states that they're in. And this is always an important one. Making sure you understand what states the organization is in. And when it's 2 different aspects I always look at it is, it's the states in which they're doing business in and states in which they're soliciting contributions. So there's 2 different things that you need to be considered about. At least in regard to the solicitation part, in this tri-state area, it's very, very easy. There are no audit requirements when you C3 organizations solicit contributions in Ohio, Indiana, or Kentucky. But when you go 1 state down into Tennessee, there is. And I'm basically, I practice most of my time in the Wisconsin, Illinois area, and both those states have audit requirements to when soliciting contributions. So just be aware of that if you're bringing in an organization that is soliciting contributions in the state, that might require you to get an audit if you didn't have one in the past. The operations, to where it's operating, there are a few states out there. California is a big one. That's California. But in California, you are going to have to apply for exempt status. So if you're merging somebody into you and they have activities in California, you are going to have to apply for tax exempt status in California. California is pretty good about giving you enough time and things in that regard. But just be aware of where the organizations are soliciting contributions and when they're doing business. And then the other one that's always out there is sales tax. Again, C3 organizations don't have to pay sales tax, but you still, if you are getting involved in selling things that require sales tax, you are going to have to collect and bring in sales tax. It's, you don't pay sales tax when you buy things, but if you sell things, you do pay sales tax. Potentially. Just making sure you understand whatever foreign operations that they have, and that's the charitable solicitation registrations. And then again, the audit requirements come into play too. For tax, just making sure you look at their 990s and 990Ps. One of the things that you're going to be doing if you're merging somebody in and you have some type of asset transfer, you're going to have to explain it on your 990. And you always put that in the best light that you can, that this organization was merged, and the assets came in, and how great it is for the organization and what it allows you to achieve. State and local tax returns, employment tax, communications, tax liens, and then as we kind of talked about a little bit, we're talking about Type 3 organizations supporting is making sure the public support test isn't kind of messed up. As Ron kind of mentioned, generally when you have mergers, you see organizations of the same C3 to C3, but we have seen some C6 organizations basically merge or basically decide to transfer all their assets into C3, so we've seen that as well. But just making sure how that affects your support test. You're going to look at, the real and physical property where everything is. You're going to listing of all the assets, understand everything in regard to policy, leases, any type of leases that they have, any type of environmental issues. You need to understand those. One of the things we should do is provide the slides to everybody, so you guys can at least do what you like with the checklist. Intellectual property is always one that's out there. Donor list, fundraising plans, any type of consulting agreements, non-disclosure agreements, any litigation that's out there you should know about, should be asking about it. Big one on the financials, making sure you understand the financials, and you guys have probably, when you're bringing somebody in, you're probably already doing your budgets and making sure that it makes sense for you to do, and that it's going to be something that's going to be positive for the organization, not only in fulfilling your exempt purpose, but the only way you can fulfill your exempt purpose is if you're still making money and able to support it. So that's part of the budgeting process and strategic plans, understanding what's all out there, what they're going to be looking at in the future, what they're thinking about, any type of liabilities that are out there, analysis of AR and AP. One of the things too, when you're going through some of the financial stuff, is to make sure you understand how that firm or that company or that business handles their accounting, because you're going to be taking that over if it is a merger. So how does it all work? I can tell you my previous time, this was probably about 10 years ago, I was involved in one that they let everybody in the organization that merged into it, they fired them. Nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew all the secrets that were out there. So make sure you understand, when you're getting involved in these situations, that you understand what the processes are, what policies they have, how do things really get done. Because there can be people out there that do keep everything in their head and not written down. But the more that they can write it down and have some type of internal control policy or something indicating what the processes are of the accounting department or the finance department, That also goes for IT, is another one. That's one thing I've always seen when you merge things together, the aspect of IT. You can plan all you want. I can tell you there's going to be a problem somewhere, someplace. There'll be something that you don't expect. So plan as much as you can, understand as much as you can, but also realize that there are going to be hiccups. That's rule one. Understanding all the different contracts that they have and affiliation agreements. I had one that they didn't realize that they had sponsorship agreements. So the entity that was merging into somebody had sponsorship arrangements. So they found that out during the due diligence process. Just make sure we all understand that. Loan agreements, promissory notes, any type of restricted gift arrangement, so you understand whatever assets are coming to you in any form, in any fashion, whether there are any restrictions to it. Because I believe you still need to follow those restrictions. Non-disclosure agreements, memorandum of understanding, insurance documents, just make sure you understand everything that you can about that organization. Human resources is always a big one because you're going to have these people, you're going to have to figure out payroll, when payroll is going to go, when payroll is going to leave. And then you're going, the one that I always like is this one. I can tell you this been a few times, but all of a sudden somebody goes, oh, did you know about that non-qualified agreement that the president had or the executive director had? Oh, yeah, he kept it in his drawer. So make sure you always ask about whether or not there's any non-qualified plan agreements. Because if all of a sudden we find out there is one, we should talk to the attorneys, because there's usually some type of issue in regard to vesting and other things that come into play. So I am surprised at the number of times that non-qualified plan agreements that are out there that are not known. So just keep that in mind. And then again, knowing all your employees, who they are, what they do, and employment policy and handles.
And on the previous page you mentioned grants. Is there anything in particular you should look at grant documents like that? You mentioned grants on the previous page. Is there anything in particular with grants?
No, I think the idea is that you're looking at it, and if that entity is coming in and there's been grant and there's been agreements that say they're going to do something, and do something such that you're actually fulfilling that grant. Does that make, because in theory, you're taking over that grant.
Yeah, and to make sure there's no terms that are going to make that, like all your contracts, they're going to put that into default. And if so, you need to contact them and get consent or approval.
Whoops. Now I'm turning it back over to you, Ron.
Yeah. Thank you, Ryan. And it's fun to talk about all the legal and accounting and all that exciting stuff. Honestly, a lot of it really comes down to these other, you really get down to the brass tacks, these other considerations of whether the merger is going to work. And frequently, almost all the time, I see organizations have consultants that kind of help them come in. It depends, I shouldn't say that depends all the time, but certainly with one more kind of equals, it's helpful to have somebody help work through some of these other, I don't want to say soft, but critically important aspects. And these are not all the considerations, but many of the ones I routinely see. And one of the most important, I think, it starts with culture. Is this another organization that shares the same values, those kinds of things that we do? I mentioned if there's an opportunity to collaborate with them on something, start to get to know them, how do you find those things out? I've been through this, our firm in the last 15 years has done 4 or 5, mergers. So I've been through this, personally, and these have been largely other geographic offices. We've had large, 130 plus offices in Indianapolis and Chicago, Minneapolis, and most recently Detroit, Columbus firm. And we have to go through this same process. Are these the kind of people that practice law the same way we do, that have the same kind of values that we do, the same kind of clients and practice that we have? It spends an enormous amount of time getting to know them, talk to the people who do this. It's the same person that does what I do. I remember being struck as I was talking to a person in Minneapolis a few years ago about this. I felt like I was dealing with what I refer to as old Taft back in the old days. That they do things, they were just parroting things to me that were exactly the way I looked at how I dealt with my client. It gave me great reassurance that, okay, I'm dealing, their clients are the same, the kind of issues they have. It's going to be great to have somebody else to talk to about these things that goes through these same things, that would be a resource to each other. But it's all the cultural things related to that, and I can't overemphasize how critically. And there's ones that we have not pursued, because this is not really what they do. Is really not. They're not bad people or whatever. Doesn't make them a bad person, but they don't do things the same way we do. It's just not a good fit. So you really have to have that. Synergies, I mentioned that, that's in the best of all worlds. That's what drives these. Is again, you're great at this, we're great at that. How can if we combine forces, we're going to be so much stronger and better. You see this, back to our firms, we've done it. Well, it'd be great not to have one or a couple of tax exempt experts. What if we could have 4 or 5 of those people? And when Ron's on vacation, there's somebody. And Ron would take vacations out, all right, or he's just tied up with a project, our other clients are not stuck waiting for you to be available to do that. You've got some more depth in what you do. So what are all those synergies? You're bringing leadership and finances. They're the best in class in this program. We'd love to get their secret sauce and bring that over to ours. I've seen this with working into billing and social service, situation. They're really good. They know that system well. They're really good with that. Leadership. I also mentioned, you've got sometimes it's driven by somebody retiring, leaving at leadership. You got that leadership void, talent void. The other though, you've got to work that out. Okay, if you don't have that, you've got 2 president CEOs. Who's going to be in charge going forward? Talk about something that kills a merger. Neither one of those people want to lose their job. They're not out looking for somebody to combine with if it's going to be there. That changes them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big ones. You look at it, and sometimes if you look at it, somebody wants to be in charge, and they're not going to be in charge anymore.
Yeah, so it's not infrequently. It is at a timing, at least, when somebody's leaving. That leads to that, and part of it's the impetus. Okay, now we have a decision, an inflection point. It's time to we can go find another person, or should we look for the talent of an existing organization that we do similar things. We saw the Meals on Wheels did kind of something similar. We do the same thing. Is that there's an efficiency of that? But then at your board level, okay, who's gonna stay on the board or boards, and who's going to say it's been good working with you, but it's a good time for me to step away. But you have to sort through all of that as you go forward. And then the laundry list of constituencies that you have to think about: how will they be impacted, and how and when and how, maybe I should say, are we going to communicate with them about our plans to do this? If this is driven by CEOs that know each other or whatever, they sort of bring the key board members and say, all right, let's have lunch and start having that next conversation. When do you really start discussing with broader board? Donors and funders, state the obvious, critical. Hey, we get grants we both get grants from this organization. It doesn't help us if we lose one of those grants, but we need 1 + 1 to equal more than 2, not less than 2. If we, in choosing how we're going to go forward, if our donors is our biggest donor going to be really, not the way I want to say that, really unhappy that we do this. Now, you can also have an opportunity here. You also have the people that are closest to you, most important, to bring them into the tent earlier and say, hey, you're so important to me. We're not letting the world know this, but we need to let you know what we're thinking about. And maybe you need to know their answer to that, by the way, before you think if they're that critical, or some of them. If your funders are going to dry up with that doesn't accomplish. Back to law firm, not our firm. I remember hearing this story about the really big clients, where they 2 big firms, 2 guys, but one was great in litigation, labor, one was great in business, banking. Combined, went to tell their clients, and very, very large banks that if you're merged with them, you're no longer doing our business. We don't like them at all. They've sued us enough. You need to know those answers before you go forward. Contracting agency, particularly if you've got government agencies, how are they going to be? Now, oftentimes, funders, contracting agencies, it's not unusual that they're encouraging this. And by the way, if they're encouraging it, you want to encourage their funding to reflect their encouragement. And they say, hey, it's inefficient for you to have all these duplication of services out there. We'd like you to combine. Well, that's great, but understand that doesn't help us if it reduces our resources to be able to do that. Think about how it impacts obviously clients. If clients that use your services, what will be better for them? How will it impact them? How are you going to communicate? One of the most important employees, and really you can say this about all of them, but certainly employees, every single person when you say this is going to say, what are they going to say? How does this impact me? Wait a minute. Now you've got somebody that also does my job with that other organization. Am I losing my job? Is my job changing? And sometimes everybody stays, and sometimes it does create. Are you going to have two CFOs? Are you going to have? Every single person is going to think exactly that question. How is that impacting? What does that mean for? What are the events? Now you also might say, if we combine with them, guess what? They've got great retirement. You're going to get more benefits. I mean, you can. It's not all negative. You might be able to sell some things to this, but suffice to say, thinking through that, that's a critical aspect. Any other organizations you collaborate with? Again, how does it impact them, community? How are they going to perceive this? Hey, it's a big giant organization coming into our little community. We like our local folks. All politics are local, as they say, and your other supporters. And then finally, bringing each. So with each level, when and how are you going to communicate this to them, bring them into the tent? How people scurry around trying to do diligence without everybody knowing what's going on is often a challenge. And then what if it doesn't go forward? I mean, there's a lot of dynamics in it. It's not unusual that I also see the branding in particular organizations. Sometimes they'll come together and they'll say, and we're going to use a new name, new umbrella to go forward. And they have that kind of a discussion. Again, often using professional consultants to really think about that. I've also seen that go forward. I've seen when they had their big meeting, announced it, and it's interesting, the employees didn't like it. I mean, so a lot that goes into those discussion. A lot more of that, again, that's where a lot of times consultants can be very good at helping you work through those types of issues. But these are just at least some of the, I don't know, maybe other things. Those are some of the things that I see that are just critical, real world, practical aspects. I mean, it's fine for me to come in from the average and say, here's legally how you can do it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's great. I'm happy to do that. But, I mean, you really do have to think through this as you're planning for a combination. Think, how are all of these things going to be impacted?
Right. It's going to be different. To merge one company in and decide to merge another nonprofit in, it'll be totally different because the makeup is just different.
So with that, I think
I've got some questions.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Similar to blending the cultures of two organizations merging, we have a plan to bring multiple locations of our agency under one roof in the near future. I'm very interested in ways we can work now to build a more common culture across programs and locations before we bring everyone together.
What do you think, Bryan?
Yeah. If you look at it, it's like you have to take a look at where you are now and where you want to be. And then take a look at those different procedures and policies and maybe getting to know each other if that's the issue and start working toward that. So then when all of a sudden the merger occurs, it'll be a lot easier. In the situation that I talked to you at the beginning, where they had a variety of different chapters and they merged it into the national office, they started to take over the accounting functions. And they had the CFO at the national office approve everything. So it was one of those things that gradually moved. So they started to get to know each other. They started to form whatever that culture is. If you guys doing that, you're deciding what the culture is. You're not, the culture isn't deciding what the culture is. You need to decide what the culture is.
Yeah, I don't have a lot. I'll go back to our firm doing this. Lots of meetings to get to know people. How do you got to, and as best you can. And in this virtual world, it's wonderful that we can do Zoom, video calls, and all those things. But as best you can, get together in person. And that's how you can. It's kind of old school in our world. You got to break bread with people, get to know them, and kind of get a real feel for them. So try to meet in person, and then we do, as we've done this, and more having, retreats or whatever, where we get everybody together, and that is a practical. Yes, Amy.
The thing I would add to that is whether, in that question sounds like it's not necessarily a merger, but just bringing people together. So whether it's that kind of situation or a combination, a merger or whatever, a key ingredient is going to be communication, and it's about change. So change management is really important, and one of the key pieces from a workshop I did a gazillion years ago, but I've always remembered it, is just you have to tell people things 8 times in different ways before they understand it. And when you're going through a change, the people who are leading the change have already processed all the questions. The people who are just hearing about the change are at the very beginning, and it's sort of like a grieving process. You have to answer the questions for where people are in that process of getting used to change. And so they're asking questions about, well, where am I going to sit, and where's the bathroom, and who am I going to eat lunch with? The really basic, how does this affect me? They're not to the cheerleading, and you can't go in and rah-rah about the change because they haven't processed through all those really basic questions. So what you communicate and how you communicate is really important when you're dealing with change.
And then having stated the opposite, change is stressful. Any change we make in our lives, maybe it's just, I don't think it's just it's just even positive change, like you're doing something you're looking forward to, but it's still out of your routine. Anything out of your routine that you don't do automatically, it creates some level of stress. So you're right. How do you believe that as much as you can? But again, I think as much as you can get together, I think Amy's point's right. It's easy to start assuming what you already know without thinking where they are.
Right.
You have a lot of time to process it. It's new to them, and it just some of that just also just takes some time. Any other people? I welcome other thoughts that people have from their own experience.
I'm sorry, I was absolutely agree with that statement, and I feel like if you don't recognize that people do have things to process before they're rah-rah, and you just say, why aren't you like this? There's a lot of resentment that then stays with you. So I think that's a really good point.
Another one is, what is done to combine/streamline back office finance functions before and after a merger?
That sounds like a Bryan question.
That's also tough. You just can't let people go before the merger. It's basically understanding what those different processes are, what different functions there are, and who is doing them. And then you take a look at the other organization, and it's the same thing. And then you're looking at that and saying, well, how can we merge it? I wouldn't necessarily, depending on the situation, encourage anybody to let anybody go in the beginning. Say you're not going to have a job, because that just brings that stress level that much higher for all the other employees. But maybe it is appropriate in the situation that you're in. So it all kind of varies, and I think that what you mentioned about the communication aspect is important, and I think that's the same thing when you're looking at just specifically the finance function.
Well, with some of those functions, it might happen. Someone says, "I don't want to be part of this merger," and so I'm going to quit. And so then it helps just kind of move it along. Okay,
this person
gone. We got this one.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, again, when you create change that makes people pause, and it's easy to, it's less stressful. Life kind of go over that automatic pilot, but you like, well, you're going to cause me to change. Now I'm going to evaluate my options. I mean, so you have to think about that. Lots of hard decisions as well. Okay, what do you want to do to incentivize the key people that you want on the bus to stay with the organization? And recognize it is going to it's going to change people. People will make their other decisions related to that. It's not always easy. It's disruptive. obviously you hope that's going to be, at the end of the day, disruptive in a way that best carries out your mission. Best, either, hey, we have to do this, we need to do this. Sometimes there's a survival aspect of this, it's a practical matter. But hopefully more of these are like, how do we make things better? How do we improve what we do?
And then the last question was about a Form 990EZ. And I'd be happy to talk about it, send that in. But basically, you just have to get one of those scenarios where we look at it. A Form 990EZ is if you have less than $200,000 in gross receipts and less than $500,000 in assets. Does that somehow then the merger come in to make you now file a full Form 990? Not the end of the world, but it's like one of those things. You should at least be prepared if that's going to be happening. Because on the full Form 990, they do ask you, do you have a conflict of interest policy? What are these policies, those policies? And it's nice to be able to plan ahead of time to make sure by the end of the year that those are adopted. So you can check the box, yes. It's one of those things that the IRS doesn't, it's not a rule, but they kind of mandate it through by putting it on a 990 to say, hey, you have these policies. The charity watchdogs are looking at you and they're scoring points for how you fill out your 990 and what it looks like. But one of those things that could happen. So if I didn't answer the question you had about the 990Z, please come up afterwards.
Other questions? You've been good about asking questions along the way,
Yeah.
which I could actually very helpful as a speaker to make this more interactive, particularly for this side.
So when we hear from clients, we hear from them from the very beginning when they've had just a conversation about potentially merging or having some kind of combination, all the way through to when the boards have really already met and talked. At what point is it advisable? When when should we engage you, Ron? When do we talk to our accountant? When do we bring in a consultant to really talk us through all of this? When are we ready for the different professionals that can help us?
Yeah, it's tempting to say generally earlier is better, but are you far enough along? Do you think this has got links to it? Again, a lot of times, not all, but in these situations, particularly again if it's more of an equal versus a kind of a parent side. Not unusual. I kind of consultants kind of helping you walk through that. But once you get serious, then again you have to what options would we consider to do it legally, and two, the due diligence, getting a non-disclosure agreement in place so you can confidentially share information earlier rather than later. I don't have a magic. When you first have your lunch, trying to figure out if there's anything going to happen, that's what we need to talk. But if it starts to get, okay, we've done that, we've talked to our board chair, we've all met, we're ready to start. And usually, or frequently in those, it's a pretty, back to consulting, kind of keeping it, all right, let's set up bi-weekly meetings and, this one, or then sometimes we'll have subgroups that are, depending on the situation, this group's going to look at the retirement assets and this group's going to look at this aspect, that programmatic, whatever. You start going through those aspects along the way. So having somebody that can kind of, and particularly that's not, if you will, on either side of it, that can help do that. I think I mentioned earlier, I've done this, obviously frequently helping one organization work through it. And sometimes, of course, they'll have just their own counsel. Occasionally, if it's a small one, maybe they've got an attorney on the board, they're kind of letting me do the throwing board. But occasionally, I'll do a joint representation where they say, we've decided we want to merge. Help us figure out the best way to do that. Now, there are legal and ethical things in the joint representation that say, hey, now we can't keep secrets with respect to this transaction. We can't keep secrets between you and all those kinds of things. We can't represent one interest over the other and all those kinds of things. But sometimes it's just to facilitate, now we know we want to do it, help us figure out the best way to do that and going forward.
So I kind of look at it, the very first two that Ron kind of talked about, understanding what the culture is and seeing if that culture fits. Those are things that, you necessarily don't need to hire us, to do that stuff that you would be doing, how bringing the two organizations benefit you from a program standpoint. That's stuff that you guys can figure out how to work it. And then when you start talking about leadership and stuff like that, then you might need some outside help. My kind of thought process.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
So when you talk about like professionals or consultants, I mean, obviously legal, financial, you need that, but like what kind of people are you talking about? I mean, are there organizations that do this kind of thing?
I don't know.
Oh, boy, go ahead.
There are various people that do this. There's some organizations. What, I don't. Go ahead.
Marta Brockmeyer is
Yes, Mark
us
worked with a lot.
several times. She's
But
great.
hasn't she retired?
I think
She
she-
may
And
be
I don't know
retired.
who's taken her spot. Yeah, that's my question
There are a
too.
few others.
Yeah.
She's the person I've certainly worked with
She's
on
done
these a number of
tons.
times and does a great job with it. I think, to your point, I think she did just.
Right.
But there are others that do that in other organizations. I'm drawing a blank on. Yeah, One Source. I keep thinking of the predecessor name. That's why I get excited. They've done a number of that and working with nonprofits. So there are a number of options, and frankly, it's one where you get some of the options and then talk to them, interview them, or whatever, and see who you think's the right, based on their experience, is going to be the right fit in your particular situation. Good question.
Does this process usually start from one board to the other board? Does it go from the board to the CEO, or is it the CEOs? Where does it typically kind of boil up from?
It varies. It's not unusual to me that for CEOs, if you think about it, if you're in the same programmatic space and your CEOs, you know each other. And again, sometimes it's driven from that frequently someone about to leave, retire, or planning their exit in a couple of years. Maybe they have that conversation. Sometimes if it's financially driven, it might be driven more by the board. Hey, this isn't sustainable, or we're concerned about how this is going to be sustainable for the next few years. Sometimes it can be board driven, but usually
It's kind of both ways.
yeah, it depends. I mean, it could be either of those. And I mentioned funders and donors. I mean, occasionally you'll have some push from your primary funders to say, we'd like you to, we think this is beneficial, we think it'd be better to do this together. Would you consider that?
We went through one that wasn't a merger, but the main funder called us because the organization was about to go out of business and dissolve, and they had one primary program left that they wanted to transfer to some other organization. So the funders actually are the ones that contacted us to see if we would absorb that program.
Yeah, and that does happen. Actually, thanks for mentioning that. Did everybody hear that? That they potentially have a situation where a program's about to go in, or organization's about to go in, they run a program that the funder really cares about, and they call them and say, would you be willing to take this program on under your organization? We don't want to lose that. Would you consider that? And that is another scenario that comes up. Other questions this
I
morning?
think that should do it.
Yeah.
Right at
Yeah.
9:29.
Thank you all for your attentiveness and interest.
Well done.